And to that point, I want to read another passage from his book, because he for all the reasons you said, he grasped where things came from. And I used to think there were only two types of reporters. There were those reporters who didn't know what tomorrow's story was, and those that did. Robert always knew what tomorrow's story was. And when I was around other reporters who were too obtuse to know what, not know what tomorrow's story was, I never worried, because I knew they'd be in the wrong place covering the wrong thing. Which is why, to be completely honest, whenever I found myself in the same city, which happened several times, including in Bosnia, with Robert, it scared the hell out of me. Because I knew he'd be in exactly the right place. He knew what tomorrow's story was. He writes, "When a society is dispossessed, when the injustices thrust upon it appear insoluble, when the enemy is all-powerful, when one's own people are bestialized as insects, cockroaches, and two-legged beasts, then the mind moves beyond reason. It becomes fascinated, in two senses, with the idea of an afterlife and with the possibility that this belief will somehow provide a weapon of more than nuclear potential. When the United States was turning Beirut into a NATO base in 1983 and using its firepower against Muslim guerrillas in the mountains to the east, Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Baalbek were promising that God would rid Lebanon of the American presence. I wrote at the time, not entirely with my tongue in my cheek, that this was likely to be a titanic battle, U.S. technology versus God. Who would win? Then, on the 23rd of October, 1983, a lone suicide bomber drove a truckload of explosives into the U.S. Marine compound at Beirut Airport and killed 241 American servicemen in 6 seconds. This, I am sure, was the suicide bomber to whom Nasrallah was referring, the one who drives into the military base smiling and happy. I later interviewed one of the few surviving American Marines to have seen the bomber. All I can remember, he told me, was that the guy was smiling. I spent months studying the suiciders of Lebanon. They were mostly single men, occasionally women, often the victims of Israeli torture or the relatives of family members who had been killed in battle with Israel. They might receive their orders while at prayer in the masjid or mosque in the South Lebanese villages. The imam would be told to use a certain phrase in his sermon, a reference to roses or gardens or water or a kind of tree. The cleric would not understand the purpose of these words, but in his congregation a young man would know that his day of martyrdom had arrived. In Gaza, even before the Oslo Agreement, I discovered an almost identical pattern. As in Lebanon, the would-be martyr would spend his last night reading the Koran. He would never say a formal goodbye to his parents, but he would embrace his mother and father, tell them not to cry if he were one day to die. Then he would set off to collect his explosives.
It's chilling, isn't it? Yeah.
But that's it. That's it. I know. I interviewed these people.
He understood. He really made the effort to understand why they did it. And I think he came closer than anybody else in the West, any non-Muslim, to understanding. And he went and interviewed their families, their parents, their siblings. And one thing that often surprised me is that people, well, for example, Hassan Nasrallah, who was just assassinated by Israel, lost his eldest son, who was fighting the Israelis. He was killed by the Israelis. And he said he was honored and he wished he had more sons. He hoped that all of his sons would be killed fighting the Israelis. And I think that no matter how many aircraft carriers and fighter jets and artillery shells and drones, and no matter what the technology and the quantity of the weapons at your disposal, it's very hard to defeat an enemy who is willing to die. And I think that's one advantage that the Americans and the Israelis simply don't have. They want to live. Their soldiers want to live. And I don't think they've ever understood this willingness to die on the part of Hezbollah and Hamas and their other enemies in the Middle East.
That's how the Taliban drove the Americans out of Afghanistan. And to that point, he writes, "Today the Arabs are no longer afraid. The regimes are as timid as ever, loyal and supposedly moderate allies obeying Washington's orders, taking their massive subventions from the United States, holding their preposterous elections, shaking in fear lest their people at least decide that regime change from within their societies, not the Western version imposed by invasion, is overdue. It is the Arabs as a people, brutalized and crushed for decades by corrupt dictators, who are no longer running away. The Lebanese in Beirut, under siege by Israel, learned to refuse to obey the invaders' orders. The Hezbollah proved that the mighty Israeli army could be humbled. The two Palestinian intifadas showed that Israel could no longer impose its will on an occupied land without paying a terrible price. The Iraqis first rose up against Saddam and then, after the Anglo-American invasion, against the occupation armies. No longer did the Arabs run away. The old Sharon policy into which the American neoconservatives so fatally bought before the 2003 invasion of Iraq, of beating the Arabs till they came to heel, or until they behave, or until an Arab leader can be found to control his own people, is now as bankrupt as the Arab regimes that continue to work for the world's only superpower. And of course, we've seen that with the genocide in Gaza, whether it's Sisi's Egypt, King Abdullah's Jordan, Saudi Arabia. They have all been complicit in the genocide, and I've spent several weeks in the Arab world since October 7th, while the rage on the street is directed not only at the Israelis for mass slaughter, but at their regimes for its complicity.
Yes, but I think that this fighting spirit, this anger which Robert referred to, it doesn't mean that the downtrodden and persecuted are always going to win. On the contrary, I think what we're witnessing now in Israel-Palestine, I fear, is the final ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. I think especially if Donald Trump wins the election on November 5th, that he will give Netanyahu carte blanche to do whatever he wants, and not just Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and they will drive the Palestinians of Gaza into Egypt, and they will drive the Palestinians of the West Bank into Jordan, and they will say the Palestinian problem has been solved. And I remember very much an interview Robert and I did with a philosopher called Leibowitz in Jerusalem.
Yes, Yeshayahu Leibowitz.
Exactly. I think it was around the time of the First Intifada, if my memory is correct. And he said something I never forgot. He said, there is no necessity in history. It's not because we thirst for justice. It's not because the Palestinians have been dispossessed. It's not because, Arabs have been betrayed through history that this will be righted. And I think that Leibowitz was right, and Robert knew that, but it didn't stop him chronicling what was happening and fighting for justice in his way through his writing.
No, I do agree with you about certainly the intent of Israel. Having just made 2 trips to Egypt, the Egyptian military has been quite categorical with Sisi that no Palestinians will be allowed to come into the Sinai. Whether that continues, I don't know.
How big is Egypt's debt, though? How many billion?
160 billion. And the point is, Sisi's corrupt and certainly would be willing to be bought off. My understanding is the military high command has told him absolutely not. But things can change. We both know the intent of Israel, as you pointed out, is to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. Of course, the Jordanian military has moved up to the border of the West Bank because they fear precisely what you said, ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. And Israel has already made it clear that they are going to, in essence, annex northern Gaza and then and create this, or already have created, but even this, let this humanitarian catastrophe fester in the South in the hopes that it does put enough pressure. But yes,